Hello and welcome to this Tara Table Talk. It's lovely to have everyone with us, both the panelists and yourselves. This session is all about mental health and well-being, entitled You'll Be Fine. My name is Sunita Pandya and I am chair of Tara Theatre. Just for you to know, I'm a female, I'm 39 years old, I'm of mixed heritage, I've got relatively long black hair. There's a lot of white hair because we haven't had the hairdressers, so imagine that. And I'm 6 foot, although actually you won't be able to see too much of that. So yes, that's me. Before I talk a little bit more about how the session's going to go, I'd like each of the panelists just to briefly introduce themselves so you know who you're hearing and seeing on this talk. So firstly, I'll kick off with Renu. Renu Aurora, please.
Thanks, Anita. I'm Renu Aurora. I'm an Asian female. I have long black hair, fair to medium brown skin tone. I have a bright pink jumper on with pink lipstick, 42 years old. If we're going for height, well, I'm just under 5 foot, but you'll never know from seeing me on screen. I have over 16 years experience in the arts, and I currently make work inspired by a life-changing accident that happened in 2017.
Thank you so much, Renu. Lovely to have you with us. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Kiran Sanghera.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Kiran Sanghera. I am a young Asian female. I have long black hair, fair to medium skin, 5'7". I work as a psychiatrist in a West London NHS trust, and I work specifically in a crisis team, which is a home treatment team, and a lot of my caseload are predominantly from the South Asian community.
Great, thank you, Kieran. Great to have you as well. And last but definitely not least, James Sanderson.
Hello, everybody. I'm James Sanderson. I'm a white middle-aged man with longer than normal hair because of lockdown. It's sort of mousy colour, and I've got dark black glasses on, and I'm Director of Personalised Care for NHS England and Improvement, and also Director of Palliative and End of Life Care, and I'm Chief Executive of the National Academy for Social Prescribing. It's great to be with everybody.
Thank you so much, James. So a little bit about this talk, and then also a little bit of the context of the talk before I hand over to each of the panelists who are going to talk more about their specific area. This talk, it comes out of, is inspired by the fact that Tara is looking at various subjects as part of its season right now. As we know, mental health and well-being isn't something that is necessarily talked about openly or dealt with openly in the South Asian community, but we very much know that it is present. In addition to this, obviously with the pandemic, there's been an increase in mental health and well-being concerns, and that's been felt not only in the Black, Asian and ethnically diverse community, but as society as a whole. And it's something that we've been hearing a lot about since we went into lockdown over a year ago now. Awareness and conversation around mental health and well-being is very live, it's very current, and of course it's very pertinent also to the artistic community, which again is very relevant to Tara's aims and ambitions. We know that the majority of South Asians working in the artistic sector are actually freelancers, and the reality of this, be that for creatives, whether it's actors, musicians, makers or managers, that they've certainly endured a year where work has been exceptionally scarce, and thus are even more perhaps likely to be experiencing some concerns around their mental health and well-being because of it. Tara absolutely and passionately believes in supporting the South Asian artistic community, and for those reasons we have literally tabled this talk and have asked these panelists to join us. So this talk, as I said at the very beginning, called You'll Be Fine, and saying that I have members of my family ringing in my ears from my childhood, is here to explore 3 areas: from lived experience of mental health and well-being, to potential treatment of those living with mental health concerns, and thirdly, potential networks, programmes or opportunities to support those with mental health and well-being concerns. The conversation, I'm sure, will touch on other areas, but that's a flavour of what the next 50 minutes or so are going to be about. We will finish the session when I wrap up, and we're going to look for some pledges going forward to ensure that we're keeping this conversation alive. But that's all to come. So without further ado, I'm absolutely going to hand over to our panelists now. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Renu Aurora.
Thanks, Anita. Hi, everybody. I'd like to open with a piece called Return to the Rehearsal Room. It's our tomorrow. Return to the rehearsal room. So how are you? Asked my friend. Well, actually, I'm feeling a bit lost, I replied. I understand, he said. It's awful to be so locked up in one space, doing nothing every day. It kills us. We are creatives. We need to be creating. Hearing the distress and sadness in my friend's voice, I didn't have the heart to tell him that I'm not feeling lost because we are locked up and yearning to be on set or in a rehearsal room. I'm feeling lost because, as a nation, we are moving back into the rehearsal room. As we all held our breath whilst each country closed its doors and dominoed down, I was overcome with an almost immediate sense of reprise. I knew these waters. I felt my friend's shock, his pain, his grief, echoing through his words with the sharpness of presence that only those who know loss know. Only those? Sounds like an elite group, a private members club, a club that nobody wants to join. But now every single one of us has been accepted into this secret, breathless space, and none of us had requested entry. My friend's grief was the world's grief. Together and together, together and together, we rise. There's a Rumi quote, being a candle is not easy. In order to give light, one must first burn. I had burned, inside and out, and from the inside out. On March 29th, 2017, whilst on my way home from work, I was hit by a bus and dragged under its wheel. My foot and lower leg were crushed. On that day, life changed forever. And on that day, my lockdown had begun. Now, I'm not so mistaken as to believe that I'm some great worldly teacher like Rumi, but I do believe that we are candles for each other. And so I wondered loosely if life, and specifically the accident, had been preparing me for this moment in time. I had gained an intimate perspective, cultivated from 3 years of being in one space, as my friend put it, travelling on the inside, and turning over the soil of my spirit. I knew new normal. Marrying the accident with the pandemic and drawing on the parallels of both spoke to our collective vulnerability, our collective fear, and ultimately our rising hope. Lockdown had unlocked my world, and on March 29th, 2020, 3 years to the day since the accident, the first in a trilogy of pandemic pieces was born. It felt as though the world had been starving to death, and I had offered it its first meal, and another, hungry for nourishment, hungry for stories, and hungry for hope. For a moment in time, we became a worldwide family. We were fearful, but we were fearful together. We were home, but we were home united. We clapped, but we clapped as one. And so, it would not have helped my friend to share the truth behind my own feelings of disorientation, because my experience of this time is in contrast to most. What my friend needed in that moment was a sense of camaraderie, to know he was not alone. And now, as the world edges back into the rehearsal room, how can we fill our shoes with love, bringing with us the gifts that we have found? Will our voices continue to land as the terrain continues to change? And might our laced and tender hearts carry on beating as one? I can't answer these questions, but I believe that art mirrors life. And so for our world to reflect the many voices that weave within it, we need to sew our stories deep into its fabric. We hold the yarn in our hands. Together, let's choose our hue. It's ours for the taking, it's ours. It's ours for the taking, it's ours. It's our tomorrow. That was Return to the Rehearsal Room, a piece that I wrote for BBC Sounds in response to the pandemic. I've told stories and made shows my whole life, from my grandmother's partition story to shows around domestic violence, and I'm constantly moved by the potential of the human story to transform. Never have we needed stories more. We as an industry will help to buffer the pain of this last year, but we as an industry are not exempt from pain. I say publicly often that 4 years ago, I became the story. On the 29th of March 2017, whilst on my way home from work, I was hit by a bus and dragged under its wheel. My foot and lower leg were crushed. In a heartbeat, everything changed. And in a heartbeat, I could no longer walk. At the time of the accident, I also had what's known as a near-death experience, an NDE, where I floated up and I saw my body underneath the wheel of the bus. I had an extraordinary life review at the time, and I also feel like I touched God in that space. Now, it's well documented that with people that have had NDEs, that the NDE resets the entire being of the person that had it. And I feel like that happened to me. The NDE did reset me. And so the beauty and the expanse that I found in that space became my saving grace throughout the horror of the next few years. So as I say, I had very severe injuries. My foot and lower leg were completely crushed. I had whiplash. I'd lost feeling in my hands and my arms. I had PTSD. So there are various different strands to my recovery. There was the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, the psychological, the artistic. And so I devoured every single book I could find on trauma, on NDEs, on post-traumatic stress, on post-traumatic growth. And I couldn't quite find one paradigm upon which to model the entirety of my experience in all the different facets. So I thought the best thing to do would be to throw myself back into work as quickly as possible in an attempt to normalize. But I later realized that by trying to normalize, I was actually minimizing. I found myself in a rehearsal room of a large regional theatre. It was a four-hander, and it was a verbatim show around domestic violence. So not a light topic, but I'm so used to playing these kind of issue-based, authentic, truthful roles and making shows around these kind of topics too, that I thought nothing of it. They had to repurpose the whole show for me due to my mobility. And I realized whilst I was in the rehearsal room that the old me was no longer, but I hadn't yet grown into the skin of the new me yet. So there was a huge chasm there. And I also hadn't realized just how much my physical limitations would impact every single facet of my life going forward. It was too much, too soon. But as we say in the arts, the show must go on. So I did the show, but I was breaking inside. And so I came away from the experience once the run had ended, and I just broke. And all I could do was stop, rest, and take stock. And then start the journey of beginning to process and integrate and assimilate everything that had happened, the trauma, the NDE, the mobility changes, everything. And that's where some of the emotional scars started to show themselves. I was grieving for an old life. I felt like I lost a part of myself. But also, that's also where I was starting to imagine what a new life might begin to look like. So I took things one day at a time in an attempt to try to find a new sense of normal and try to find my way through, but find my way through with a new sense of purpose. And I realized that once I'd given myself that time and that space, I began to realize that I would eventually make work from this, and that the entire experience would shape me both personally and professionally, because my skill set was all still there, but the way in which I would use it would need to be different. So I repurposed my entire career and became what I now define as a sit-down artist. And I also realized that the experience would deepen me as an artist too, for which I feel incredibly grateful. So when lockdown happened last year, for me, it was a real leveler, because suddenly everybody was in the same space as me. Everybody was at home. And I'd planned to re-enter the industry in 2021, this year, softly. But because of the pandemic and given my sort of 3-year lockdown, I realized I had things to say artistically that people were interested in and that I hoped would be able to help the world in some way. So I created a series of audio arts pieces in response to the pandemic with my experience as a backdrop for BBC Sounds. So I essentially re-entered the industry last year in 2020. Very organically, I sort of tumbled back in without needing to knock. So my current project is a project called The Burgundy Book, which is an arts podcast around the accident, the NDE, and the journey that's followed. It's Arts Council funded, and it's going to be released on all major podcast platforms in January of next year, 2022. I'd like to play the teaser now, if I may.
But you see, following a trauma, the old self and the old life are no longer. My old self and my old life were left underneath the wheel of that bus. And the inner journey that can follow has no timeline. It has no time limit. It simply is. It doesn't exist in a linear space. I would ask myself repeatedly, what's the purpose of re-entering the world quickly? To do, and do, and do? To do what? To do more? This was not something I could understand, and it's not something I resonate with anymore. For me, it's been about searching the experience, mining it, exploring it, getting to its core and finding its gold. Because often, in the midst of pain, there is gold. I knew that in the eye of this storm...
I feel as an artist, it's my responsibility to share my experience as authentically as I can, to give people a sense of reflection, home, and hope within my words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renu. Gosh, what a profound and deeply moving experience. And those segments felt very, very pertinent. And I think I'm already, as each of the panelists are speaking, I'm just jotting down some thoughts for the wrap up at the end. And I think there's already some real takeaways there about finding some, there's gold in that pain, although it's deeply, deeply difficult. And I really liked your term about stopping, resting and taking stock. There was something there about processing such difficulties and what people are experiencing. And you talked about resetting. The NED gave you a reset. I think 2020 is probably one of the years where we all felt the world had a hard reset in many ways, and what we're now processing and stopping and resting and taking stock of that. So thank you very much. We will have questions after each of the panelists have spoken. Thank you very much, Renu. So I'm going to move on to Dr. Kiran Sanghera. It'd be lovely to hear from you, Kiran, now.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Dr. Kiran Sanghera, and as far as I can remember, I've always been really fascinated about the brain and the mind and mental health. So before actually studying medicine, I had done a bachelor's and a master's in neuroscience from the Institute of Psychiatry. I then went on to study postgrad medicine, and I trained within various areas which really helped me gain an idea of stigma and mental health in different communities. So I trained across New York and London, and I'm a member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and I've always been very a strong advocate for BAME health inequalities, be that with regards to organ donation, mental health. So through that, I've been open to a lot more experiences, a lot more discussions through media appearances, charity fundraising events, public health messaging. And this has all given me quite a really unique insight, I find. So like I said, I work for a crisis team, and how that works is we essentially try to prevent patients from coming into hospital. So our aim is to treat patients in their own environments with their mental health difficulties. They're often quite acutely unwell by the time they come to us. So being a crisis team, obviously think of mental health breakdowns. Sometimes unfortunately they're so unwell that we have to use legal the legal system and detain them against their will to come into hospital. But what I find so interesting is how the majority of my caseload are from South Asian backgrounds. So clearly I can see firsthand the effects of stigma and mental health in the communities and how that's translating to patients' lives and the knock-on effects to their families and the wider community. So I treat and diagnose a variety of mental health, acute mental health crises, ranging from PTSD, OCD, anxiety disorders, psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, personality disorders, substance misuse disorders, the list goes on. But essentially, what I've found when I enter each person's house, which I still to this day always find a privilege, to be let in to a family's most intimate experience where they're very vulnerable. The stigma actually impedes their help-seeking behaviours. From my experience, what this has come down to is ultimately really, really strong misunderstandings and misconceptions, which have actually been enforced through the generations. And this misunderstanding is multifaceted. So we have a lack of education and awareness. I mean, there is a literal lack of terminology and language used. So how can you actually understand something when you can't discuss it? How can you convey your experience when your mother tongue doesn't give you the terminology to be able to express that? I myself really struggle to do assessments in my own mother tongue, which is Punjabi. So if I see patients who can't speak English, where they can get an interpreter or I can interpret, but I find that because of the lack of language, the terminology, it makes me feel like it's quite sad that I can't get an accurate enough impression of what you're going through. Obviously, public health messages are not culturally contextual, so there's an issue there with regards to trying to address the misunderstandings as well. This whole, the lack of understanding just then leaves fears and superstitions to just go unchallenged, especially with the older generations. A lot of communities can attribute mental illness to supernatural concepts like demonic possession, the jinn, black magic, evil eye, nazar, and things like that. So I've seen a lot of this in my work. And essentially, it's a lot of families encouraging their loved one who's really suffering to turn to faith and prayer and counsel over and above evidence-based medication, or going to India, doing a pilgrimage. This has all led to what I see, such high levels of shame, secrecy, fear. I've seen patients who have kept their diagnosis, really significant diagnoses, such as schizophrenia, a secret from their partner, from their children, and from their grandchildren. And they've only been able to see this when they've been hospitalized. And then it's become, it's out in the open. There's also what I've seen is really complex family dynamics in our community. So family members either being too involved, really, really overprotected, trying to maybe shield their family member from gossip from the community, but also not allowing them to nurture their own independence. And on the flip side of that, I've seen families which can be totally isolating, feeling ashamed, not wanting to be tarnished by association with their family member with regards to how it will impact them and their standing in the community. When these individuals are feeling isolated, that must be the most frightening experience of not being able to share what they're going through. I just think, how lonely must that be? One of the most beautiful things in life, I think, is for us to be able to connect, to share with each other our experiences, to find support, to be validated and seen and heard. This in itself is empowering, and this in itself is healing, and that's missing in a lot of cases. Add on to that, within our community, the huge social pressures to conform, adherence to these social norms is key in the South Asian community to achieving, maintaining respect and standing within the community. And this could be academic success, employment, getting married, having kids, owning a property, things like that. And anything outside of those norms, i.e. mental health, is deemed as abnormal and, giving you a poor standing in community. So these are real barriers that need to be broken down. Particularly, I've seen an issue with men, and when they have actually shown some emotional vulnerability that can be seen as a weakness, that has then led to what we call maladaptive coping techniques. So drugs, alcohol, different addictions, as opposed to, positive, healthy coping techniques. Marriage prospects being under threat. I've heard so many times parents of my patients telling us that everything has to stay confidential because they've arranged a marriage, and their partner, the future partner, not having any idea about this. And that's not informed consent. That's not an informed agreement, is that? Quite interestingly, what I see as a very regular pattern is a term called somatization. So this is when people are interpreting their mental health difficulties, but they're expressing it as a physical issue because they feel like that will be more accepted. So having a headache, feeling tired, general body aches. But the issue lies there with they're not accepting of psychiatric medications. They won't be accepting of psychological talking therapies. Also the fact that, we're a migration immigrant community, the stresses, they're already at risk of mental health problems from various stresses, financial stresses, acculturation, discrimination, lack of social support, language barriers, hence why our community has such chronic physical health illnesses, just as mental health. So in my role, I find that I'm trying to break down the stigma within each family unit, within each patient that I see, to make sure that's not a barrier to them receiving treatment, for recovering post-crisis, and also, for the rest of their life, and trying to enable them to use the tools to be able to talk and seek the right help. So we call it psychoeducation, where I'm explaining to my patients, and then they're often quite shocked that actually what's going on, there is actually a biochemical change in the brain, just as there is going on in the body with a physical health problem, hence the need for medication and treatments. So I think it's just quite telling that so many patients, so many of these subtle warning signs and sometimes really obvious red flag signs are being dismissed, where there's room there for prevention, there's room there for open communication to not let things escalate, but it's not quite happening. So that's a summary of kind of the main issues of what I think are contributing to the stigma within the community and what I'm seeing with patients.
Thank you so much, Kieran. It's as you were talking, I don't know if you know the book called The Boy with the Top Knot by Satam Sanghera, which is, I don't want to give because the crux of that story is some part of what we're talking about, but that idea of these kind of issues being so taboo and so abnormal that they are silenced and they generationally just pass on and people don't speak about it. And I think, what we hear, what you're then seeing and experience is the sort of almost the culmination, the outpouring of that, whether it's physical and I think that point you talked about where there is real shame, fear and secrecy, people just don't feel like they are tooled, they don't have the assets, they don't have the language, their mother tongue or speaking English, they don't have those assets to be able to speak about it in maybe ways that other communities are able to speak about it or articulate how they're feeling and how they're expressing it. And I think that point around psychoeducation and barriers and actually looking at what are the assets that help people through those barriers really resonates very much so. So thank you for that. We'll pick up on a couple of other things that both Renu and you have spoken about in some of the questions. So now I'd like to hand over to James Sanderson.
Thanks, Sunita. So great to have the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about the work that we've been doing in NHS England and also through the National Academy. I'm hugely privileged, Renu, to hear your story and you sharing those experiences. And I think one of the things that really resonated with me is your line about sewing the story into the very fabric and that sense of actually, as a healthcare system, do we always listen to those stories? Do we enable that personal experience and voice to come through in the way in which we design care and treatment? And actually, the evidence says that we don't always do that. Around 40% of people say they're not as involved in their care and support as they would like to be. A further 40% of people say that they don't have a plan for their care, especially those people living with long-term conditions, and that there's no plan in place. And actually, even when we do try and involve people, picking up on something that Kieran mentioned in terms of some of the barriers, 40% of people say they don't understand the health information that they're provided with. So actually, we have a system that isn't responding as well as it needs to individual care and support. And one of the other things that you mentioned, Renu, around the fact that you were going through all of this trauma, and at the same time you've got mental health needs and physical needs, and they were all happening at exactly the same time. And again, we're sometimes too divided in healthcare settings, where we assume that somebody's got cancer on a Tuesday and mental health issues on a Wednesday, but never the two things on the same day. And of course, our lives are so complicated, and all of those things are happening to us all the time. So what can we do about this? Well, that's where personalised care comes in. And personalised care, to me, means giving people choice and control over the way their care is planned and delivered. And it's based on what matters to people and builds on the experiences and skills, knowledge and confidence that come from themselves, because people have a huge amount of experience, regardless of how that's gained. And actually, in terms of creating sustainable, more responsive healthcare systems, we need to be tapping into those assets that people bring to their own care, whether that's stories that they've sewn deep into the fabric of themselves, or whether that's, as Kieran was talking about, the family situation and the specific unique circumstances that that person's living in. How can we ensure that we bring those things into the care of an individual? And we need to do that by starting with something called shared decision making. We need to be engaging with people so that they understand the various treatment options that may be available. And the evidence points to the fact that when shared decision making is done well, and that conversation happens with the individual, and the individual is able to make a really informed decision, that actually they make different decisions to what we sometimes assume they're going to make. And you can reduce costly, risky treatments by about 20% just by having a different conversation. And that might be as simple as something like whether or not somebody chooses to take antibiotics. And we know that issues in society of antibiotic resistance, of opiate addiction could be resolved in part by having different conversations with those individuals. We also know that people need a plan. People living with long-term conditions and complexity in their lives, they need a plan that looks holistically at their lives and also starts to consider the barriers that they may be facing in order to lead the life that they would like. And some of that's looking way beyond their healthcare. And Kieran mentioned around the fact that people can sometimes convert unknowingly issues of mental health into physical aspects. And we also know, in terms of the evidence, that at least 1 in 5 GP appointments nowadays are purely for non-medical need. The issues that people are seeking support with could be related to housing or social isolation or loneliness or debt or relationships. And actually sometimes those issues can manifest in physical conditions, but the root cause is not necessarily that physical issue that the person's facing. The root cause is one of those social barriers. And the way in which we're trying to tackle that is through social prescribing. So this isn't about saying that drugs are bad. We still need drugs in society. And you know, at the point that we're recording this, we're seeing the huge benefits of science and the creation of a vaccine, where we've got almost 30 million people now vaccinated in the country, which is hopefully going to get us out of the lockdown that we've been living through. And we still need medications for all sorts of things, but actually there is a limitation to the medical model. There's a limitation to what drugs can do, and consequently we need to start embracing as a society other things that are going to help maintain our health and well-being, whether that's mental health or our physical health. And social prescribing is simply how we can link people to social solutions for their health, how we can create the opportunity based on what matters to them to find things in society that they're going to really enjoy. And that could be the arts, that could be singing, that could be dance, that could be looking at the natural environment and getting people out and about in nature. It could be sports and exercise. It could be advice and education and lifelong learning, but some way of connecting with people and activities that helps to start breaking down those barriers. It could also be linked to peer support. And I think one of the things that really is important, certainly in terms of the communities that we're talking about here, is just how powerful it can be to meet somebody who is from the same community, that's going through the same thing that you're going through. And that power of connection that comes from that is really important. But also we know that building individual agency, building the skills, building the confidence that people have to achieve their outcomes is something that we need to get right in the system. So all of this comes together within a model that we have called personalised care. And we've developed in the NHS a model called universal personalised care that now we're targeting for a rollout across the NHS system. And that contains all the tools that we want to try and deploy in order to give people their best chance. And some of the experiences that we've heard today from Kieran and Renu are the very things that we want to capture within this model to try and shift the focus so that we're really tapping into what people need. Thank you, Sunita.
Thank you, James. So much of that, again, resonates. Just what came across to me was the idea, the key words about agency, the idea of choice and control, the idea even that I don't think there is even the language around the idea that you can have a personal, the idea of having a designed set of care and treatments, and that is person-centric as opposed to what is out there and you just take what there is. So the idea that, you know, and I don't think that's necessarily a conversation that's even happening at in South Asian community, let alone in the wider, in the wider community as well. So I think I think for everyone, what's really come through for me is that idea of choice and individual experience. And I really like that point, James, about connection. There is something about mirroring. So if you see somebody that looks like you or sounds like you, that is going through what you're going through, whatever that similarity or mirroring is, suddenly it feels more, it feels like you could get through it potentially, or there's somebody there you can connect to. I mean, we talk a lot in the arts about, diverse casting because people want to see people like themselves on stage. The same principle ripples through to what we're discussing here in terms of treatment, in terms of being able to connect to people who look and sound like you, because that makes you not feel alone. So I think there's a lot of echoes, obviously, across all the three of yourselves as panelists, but that individual experience feels really crucial. So thank you all for your contributions thus far. I'd love to just move on to a few questions that have risen, not just from what you've individually talked about, but also just in terms of the areas that we're thinking about. And maybe Kieran and Renu, I could pick up with you first. I think it's really clear from what we've talked about that, mental health and well-being is clearly a taboo subject in the South Asian community. And Kieran, I'm really interested in your point about generational. I wonder if I could just start with you, Kieran, first. Do you see a sort of a prevalence that is worse in one generation compared to others, compared to maybe a younger generation? And do you potentially see a younger generation being able to articulate their experiences better than an older generation?
Yeah, so what I find with my patients is that for the older generation, there are a lot of disadvantages. A lot of them don't speak English. Therefore, they are literally lacking, as we were saying, that terminology, which is not there in a lot of South Asian languages. They've never been educated about mental health, so they themselves don't understand what they're going through. So there's multiple barriers that we discuss about them seeking help. Also, fear of the unknown as well. If you're not sure about something, you don't understand it, there's a lot of fear, not knowing who to turn to, because then there's this whole thing about your status and the stigma and the idea of keeping everything within the family, because you care so much about what everyone thinks and what, is it going to implicate my children getting married, my grandchildren getting married? The whole, that whole idea is huge in a lot of South Asian communities. So I think there's so many reasons why, unfortunately, the elder population don't. And a lot of them, I've seen patients who are literally psychotic and they think that it's due to diabetes. Now, wow, diabetes can cause mental health problems, but not on that level. It can't cause psychosis, So it's such a, like we were saying about just, saying that they've got mental health, physical health problems instead. So there is an issue with them coming forward. It's often younger family members really encouraging them. And then I find, especially the elder generation, very hesitant to take psychotropic medications, very keen to instead go to their mother native country. Again, much more, faith, I think, is really important, but still it has to be holistic. If you're not actually treating the neurochemical imbalance, it's not going to help. With the younger generation, I'm happier to see there is definitely more discussion happening. So I think that there is more younger people are getting involved in conversations. And I think a lot of it is a language barrier. They've been educated here, they're open to public health messaging is a huge concept as well. And I just feel like services they're able to get into services easier, whether that's drug and alcohol services or school and colleges will pick up problems, where the elderly community are quite isolated in that. I mean, I haven't been to one temple where I've actually seen mental health resource information, you know, or something in their own language for them to actually pick up on. So unfortunately there is quite a difference. And also the idea of kind of like black magic and superstitions and again that, so yeah, there's not as much elderly coming forwards, but now I'm seeing, you know, some more younger people. But again, there is a lot of hesitancy. And I think interestingly, I see if the younger person is within a multi-generational household, they have a lot of barriers to accessing care. And there's been times where we've had to really see patients alone, because feeling like the parents are actually barriers to care as well. So, but hopefully I think things are starting to change. There's a bit more communication, a bit more conversation happening.
Thanks, Kieran. Renu, I saw you nodding and agreeing there, especially when Kieran said about multi-generational households. It'd be good to hear, you know, I hope I'm not asking too much of a personal question, but it'd be good to hear, you know, you spoke so eloquently about resetting and having your own personal lockdown. And I wondered how, with your PTSD, how that was, whether that was understood by your family and whether that was another element you had to manage as well.
Yeah, it was. I suppose because, and I feel like as artists, we are, I think, slightly in a different position because, you know, you have to cultivate a sense of an inner world to access certain states, to be in the arts anyway, to be a performer or whatever you do within the arts. So I kind of think, for me, my family were so used to me having conversations around, you know, how am I feeling, and, you know, they know I have an emotional landscape and it's a rich one and it always has been. And so that kind of conversation was never off the table, as it were, in my family. Yeah. But I did see that within the wider community that, you know, the moment I was able to mobilize a bit more on my crutches, people would often say to me, you know, oh, you're back to your old self now. Or, you know, sort of in the early days before I could even sort of do that, they'd say, oh, you know, bring the old Renu back. We miss her. And I'd say, well, the old Renu ain't coming back. You know, she's left underneath the wheel of the bus. That's gone. That's history. You know, so there was a real sense of misunderstanding there. Sort of, even within the younger generation, within sort of my community, I did find, because it's not necessarily talked about all that much in terms of how a trauma can impact, or anything can impact sort of every facet of one's being, and how there's often a before and an after, and you need to assimilate the changes, and then that gives you a new sense of self almost. They almost see that, you know, hurry up, get back to normal quickly, get you know, normalize really quickly, and then we feel okay. So I realized very much in my conversations, you know, sort of early on, that people's sort of reticence in kind of going there with me was only really because they were fearful of, you know, what this meant for them. And they were fearful of their mortality, and me talking about an NDE and near-death experience. Totally, you know, I could feel their brain just, you know, going into a roller coaster, going, whoa, my goodness, you know, and I could really feel that sense of, we don't talk about this stuff. Why are you talking about it so openly?
Yeah. So it's their fear, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, it's an interesting, because it brings your bravery out, but it needs their bravery to meet you halfway. And actually, if they can't do it, then, you know, they're looking for the old Renu, and you go, actually, Renu's here, but this is a new version and a different version of me, potentially. No, I was just going to say, the other bit is you talked about the language is, I do think the artistic community, you know, without meaning to sound too trite, we do study the human form in a way. It's about storytelling, it's about people. So, you know, the self-awareness and what is actually going on in the subconscious and underneath is actually part of our bread and butter. We do that all the time, whether it's through music, whether it's contemporary music, whether it's visual art, like what's going on, whether it's actually through amazing film, or, you know, we always think about what's going on underneath. So there is actually a inherent language that we have, I think, in the art to be able to explore that, which actually, you know, it's not a language that other communities necessarily have.
No, and I think if I was, you know, sort of my age, my generation, and I was an architect, I don't think I'd have any sense of emotional, you know, I mean, when I was at school, emotional literacy, emotional intelligence just wasn't taught. I mean, I know it is now. And in fact, I teach young people for their LAMDA, which is London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art exams. And so my students are, you know, constantly talking to me. In fact, mental health's become a buzzword often, you know, and I think that's, in some ways, that's a good thing, because it's so much in their vocabulary that it's an everyday thing. So we talk about their mental health every single time I see them, because it is such a sort of, it's at the forefront of their minds all the time. And that makes me so pleased that they're talking about mental health in schools so constantly, and with their friends, and they're texting about it, and they've got various apps, and so much more readily than I had when I was sort of younger. But I mean, I feel very grateful to be an artist, partly because of this reason, because it's given me an emotional language that is so rich and so broad and so diverse that I really wouldn't have had. You know, if I look at my family and my younger brother and stuff, that isn't necessarily, you know, there because they haven't learned the skills to cultivate an emotional landscape, and through no fault of their own, there just wasn't the resources there when they were growing up.
Yeah, thank you, Renu. James, sort of building on from that, I wonder, you know, for social prescribing as well, does it feel like there are communities that are not reaching out to it, or are not aware of it? And how do you feel that, I mean, perhaps not just with social prescribing, but, you know, we've talked about public health messaging. How are we going to address that as a society to make sure that, you know, we are trying to these networks and these opportunities to look for care in, you know, not just with drugs or such like, but how do you think we can widen that out to other communities like the South Asian community?
I think this is a really big challenge. I mean, just listening to Renu and Kieran speak about, you know, the issues of accessing the right services. You know, I have both male and white privilege in society, and, you know, accessing things is still tricky for me. And we've got to think about the layers of access challenges that people have, and start breaking down those barriers step by step for people. I think one of the things with social prescribing that is presenting a really great opportunity to start cutting through some of those barriers is that we are putting in place link workers who are people that are going to be based in general practice. We're going to have 4,500 of them across the country over the next few years. And those individuals will have time to spend with the person that's seeking support, to properly find out what matters to them, to properly look at the barriers that they're facing, and to engage with them at a closer level than the GP is able to do within the short consultation time that GPs have. And some link workers will spend 3 to 4 hours with an individual over a course of a few weeks, really finding out what those issues are. And I think this is incredibly powerful, because actually, as a new person within that workforce, we're also finding that link workers are embedded in their local communities. So hopefully we're creating a workforce that's diverse, to reflect, as you were saying, Sunita, about mirroring, that we can find a workforce that mirrors the communities that they're supporting. And consequently, that conversation and those barriers can be eased, and I think that presents a great opportunity to transform the way in which we perceive healthcare. I think a lot of this it's about changing the relationship that people have between themselves and their health and well-being, because I think we need to do that as humans. Sometimes we've lost sight of the fact that we have to support ourselves, and it's also changing the relationship between ourselves and the system that is there to give us the support that we need to seek from other people, other specialists like Kieran. And I think that, you know, those two relationship shifts are the key thing that's going to start unlocking the support that people need. So in terms of the take-up rate of social prescribing, we've not unfortunately got any demographic information yet, because it's still a new program. But that's something that we need to look at to make sure that it is enabling people from all communities to be able to access, because this is something that should genuinely be a universal support service, because we all need connection. We all need the ability to undertake activity. We all need arts and culture in our lives. We all need exercise. You know, those things are inherently good for us. And consequently, this is where we imagine that social prescribing could create a revolution in health and well-being. It's as powerful as that, I think, if we get it right.
I think that neatly moves us on to sort of the final section that I wanted to think about, which is that hearing from all of you, I think there's something about what are going to be our takeaways, our forward looking, and the learnings we want to take, or making sure that what's part of this conversation that we want to keep alive in our respective areas. And, you know, I know at Tara, they're going to make a commitment going forward that there'll always be a staff member who will be a mental health first aider that will be in the building. And again, that's, you know, that's potentially one change, but it could be seen as a small change, but it's a real change, and it's a real commitment to, you know, being able to look after the community that come through the doors at Tara, whether it's artistic, whether it's makers, whether it's the local community, and that feels important. And I think, James, you talked about a revolution. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had this conversation again, whether it's in 1 year, 3 years, or 10 years, and we could track the beginnings of the revolution that started potentially in the local area in Wandsworth, where Tara is based, but certainly in that idea of allowing ourselves to look at real change going forward, and how the South Asian community in particular could breathe oxygen into this conversation. I wonder if I could ask each of you for the last 5 minutes or so, just to thinking about that, the idea of the takeaway, or the idea of how you could see this conversation staying alive, you know, keeping alive, keeping that oxygen going, and what you'd want people to really think about in terms of how we can address these taboos, these issues around mental health. I know that's quite a big question, but what would be the areas that you would hope people could take away, and are there any small or big actions that people could do with that? I know I've put a question out there, and I can see everyone's brains thinking away, but I'm going to say, Kieran, would you be able to kick us off on takeaways that we could ask people who are maybe listening and watching this to think about in terms of mental health and well-being with our South Asian community?
I think it's quite a simple one, but if we actually implement this in our day-to-day life, it will have huge impact. So just normalizing the conversation at the dinner table. Mm-hmm. So literally asking, how are you? Because so many of us automatically respond, yeah, fine, but no, how are you really? How are you feeling? And having that as having that open conversation, being that part of your, you know, regular day-to-day life, I think with people who you feel, you know, you can open up with, I think is great. But so that's the first part. The second part is hopefully they feel comfortable enough to open up, is to just attentively listen. You know, they don't expect you to have all the answers, but a lot of the time, if you can just listen attentively, non-judgmental way, be open, if you can show some empathy, you know, just so that they feel, you know, you can validate their experience so they don't feel alone. Because when patients have harbored these feelings completely alone, we've seen sharp, you know, risks of suicidal thoughts and things like that. Something so simple as just normalizing the conversation at your dinner table, people you feel comfortable with, firstly, because I've been surprised at how many people live in the same roof and they still have no idea that person's having a mental breakdown. Yeah, I'd say that, those two things.
I think those are those keywords of normalize, validating, how can I help, or how are you, and genuinely asking how are you, you know, that feels really, really important. Renu.
Thanks, Anita. Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. Yeah, I suppose for me, I'd say, to add to that, that I say this within the arts, but I also feel like that within the wider community, that we're stronger together. You know, we're not islands. We're not made to be isolating. And, you know, I feel as a freelancer, freelancers are isolated enough as it is, because we are freelancers, without the added isolation of lockdown and everything that's happened over the past year. And so I think that a lot of the, like, Tara has a group called Listening Space, a safe space to come and just be and, you know, reflect. And I think those kind of spaces are so important, because they just give people a sense of community and validation and collaboration, even though we're not sort of making work. It's just a space to show up and be seen and be heard and sort of be validated, as it were. So I suppose for me, it's about sort of reaching out and just knowing that we found a connection last year as a world, because the world shrunk so much over the past year because we all went through the pandemic together. And I think if we can keep that connection, keep those hands being held, and keep putting our hands out and going, you know, hold my hand, both as organizations and as people, I really think we can really create some kind of revolution, as you were saying, James, around finding ways to stay connected and finding ways to actually empathize with people and showing up with a real sense of presence with people.
I've got a lovely image there of a family sitting around their dinner table, and there are moments where they, you reach out and you actually physically hold somebody's hand as they're reaching out to you, asking for help. That's starting to feel very tangible in my brain. Thank you, Renu. And James, your thoughts?
So sort of continuing from what Renu and Kieran have said, I think, the NHS, an amazing institution, and we've seen the NHS step up with, incredible might over the past year. But actually, we know what makes us well under normal circumstances is not what goes on in GP practices and hospitals. And in order to recover from the pandemic, and in order to break down some of the issues that we've been talking about tonight and get through to people, we need society to come together, and we need people to work together across traditional boundaries. And I think, one of the takeaways is just what a fantastic role Tara Arts is playing. This talk, using the connection that people have to a theatre and an artistic space to discuss health and well-being, is not something we'd been doing 10 years ago. And I think this is a really great opportunity. And through the connections that we're making through the National Academy for Social Prescribing, with things like our Thriving Communities programme, trying to connect organisations up at a community level to have more of these conversations. Because if we get to people through the institutions that they're touching on a daily basis, those institutions that are in their communities, that are respected because they're there every day for them, I think we can stand a better chance of changing the direction of people's health and well-being. And some of that's, as I say, about working across boundaries that traditionally have been there. It's about statutory services like the NHS working with theatres, working with sports-based organisations, working with faith-based organisations, but it's also about those organisations at a community level working with each other as well. The theatre being linked to the sports club, being linked to the dementia cafe, being linked to the mosque. How can we get those institutions working together under this common goal that we all share, that we want people to live their best life?
Thank you, James. I think that's such a great point. And actually, as you say that, the next image that comes to my mind is Tara as this beating heart in Wandsworth, as you just come out of Earlsfield's train station, and maybe its tentacles can reach out far and wide, and like you said, be more than just a theatre, reach out to the local community, those key gatekeepers in those community, and see how we can breathe oxygen into this conversation and make sure we're still talking about it. I've jotted down 2 key words for me, which feels around connection and compassion. There is something about not judging each other, and actually allowing the space for people to say, I'm struggling because of X, or today hasn't been a good day. And I certainly feel like my pledge that I'm going to take away is to do exactly what Kieran said, is I'm going to bring it up at the dining table, and actually this evening just ask people sitting around me, how are they doing? And how's it feeling? And reaching out to family members. And if we all start small, it's amazing the momentum that we could all bring together into something much, much bigger than ourselves. So finally, thank you all for being part of this panel. It's been such a rich conversation. I feel quite overwhelmed in some ways to have heard all this, such stories, but also such dedication about this area and how we can really work together. I really hope those listening and watching have enjoyed it as well, in terms of it being a rich conversation in terms of the potential that we have going forward. I know that at the end of the talk there'll be a slide for some networks we're going to share for people in case they want to reach out. As ever, I'm sure Tara's here, and we're very much keen to hear from people about the subject matter. But finally, a huge thank you to Renu, to Kieran, to James for your time. And yes, let's see how the revolution shapes up in the next few weeks, months and years. Thank you all again.
It's ours for the taking, it's ours. It's ours for the taking, it's ours. It's our tomorrow.